The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, and Raymond Winslow read every single word of it 3 times before he set it down on the kitchen table and stared out the window at the cracked, sun-scorched land that had been slowly killing him for the better part of 2 years. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that had known nothing but hard work since he was 12, and he had come to the Cimarron Valley of New Mexico Territory with every intention of building something that would last a century. What he had built instead was a ranch that was hemorrhaging money, a bunkhouse full of men who respected him but needed stronger leadership than a single man could provide alone, and a reputation in the territory for raising some of the finest quarter horses anyone had ever seen, which meant absolutely nothing if he could not keep the fencing repaired, the books balanced, and the water rights secured against the encroaching pressure of the Ralston Cattle Company, whose owner, Gerald Ralston, had been making quiet and not-so-quiet inquiries about purchasing the Winslow spread for the past 8 months. Raymond was not a man who gave up easily. But he was a man who was honest with himself, and he was honest enough to admit on that particular Tuesday morning that he needed help, real help, the kind of help that a partner could provide. His cousin Eliza, who lived in Denver and had her finger in every social arrangement from Colorado to Texas, had taken it upon herself to correspond with a placement agency in Chicago, a reputable one. She had assured him repeatedly in her letters that assisted educated women of good character in finding suitable situations in the Western territories. Eliza had written to him that she had identified a candidate. She had included, along with her own letter, 2 letters of reference and 1 very brief but remarkably direct letter from the candidate herself. The references described Charlotte Ralston as intelligent, capable, hardworking, and this was the word that appeared in both letters, written by 2 entirely different people who had known her in entirely different contexts. Headstrong. One reference, written by a schoolteacher named Mrs. Adeline Foss of Springfield, Illinois, noted that Charlotte Ralston possessed an uncommon determination that some might find challenging, but that the right person would recognize as an extraordinary gift. The other reference, written by a farmer named George Rourke for whom Charlotte had managed accounts and correspondence for 3 years, stated plainly that she was the finest worker he had ever employed, and that her headstrong nature had saved his operation from a fraudulent feed supplier who had been cheating him for 2 seasons before Charlotte had noticed the discrepancy and confronted the man directly, without waiting to be told to do so. Raymond read the word headstrong in both letters, and instead of feeling the hesitation that Eliza had warned him about, she had added a note saying she hoped he would not be put off by that particular word. He felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight for a very long time. He picked up Charlotte Ralston's own letter last. It was short, 3 paragraphs. No flowery language, no performed modesty, no careful circling around what she was and what she wanted. She wrote that she was 26 years old, that she had managed a household since she was 17 when her mother died and her father had needed help raising her 2 younger brothers, that she had kept farm accounts for 3 years, that she could ride a horse, that she was not afraid of hard work or difficult weather, and that she was looking for a situation in which her capabilities would be genuinely used rather than merely tolerated. The last line read, "I am not interested in being an ornament to any man's house. If that is what is required, I would ask that you not write back." Raymond sat with that letter for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and wrote back. He wrote that he needed someone who could manage the household accounts, handle correspondence with suppliers and buyers, keep the bunkhouse hands on schedule, and he wrote this with some deliberation, stand her ground when Gerald Ralston's men came riding up to the fence line looking to make trouble. He wrote that Headstrong, in his estimation, was exactly what his ranch needed. He posted the letter that afternoon and spent the next 3 weeks pretending he was not watching the road every time a rider came anywhere near the Winslow property. Her response arrived in 2 weeks and a day. She wrote that she had considered his letter carefully and that she would arrive by the end of April, traveling by train to Las Vegas, New Mexico territory, and from there by stage to Cimarron. She asked him to have someone meet her at the stage depot on the 28th. She noted that she would be wearing a blue traveling coat and that she had a trunk and 2 bags. She did not ask if he was kind. She did not ask if the house was comfortable. She asked only one question at the end. Is the land good? He wrote back immediately. The land is extraordinary. Come and see. The 28th of April arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted, and Raymond drove the wagon into Cimarron himself rather than sending one of his hands because it seemed like the right thing to do. He was not a man who was prone to nerves, but he sat on the wagon bench with his hat in his hands for the 20 minutes he waited at the depot, and he turned the brim of it round and round without realizing he was doing it until old Hector Ruiz, who ran the dry goods store across the street, called out from his porch that Raymond looked like a man waiting on a hanging. Raymond put his hat back on and sat up straight and told himself that whatever happened, he had made a practical arrangement, and practical arrangements did not require nerves. Then the stage rolled in, and the door opened, and Charlotte Ralston stepped out onto the dusty street of Cimarron, New Mexico territory, and Raymond forgot entirely that this was supposed to be practical. She was not what he had expected. He had not let himself form a very clear expectation, but whatever shape it had taken in the back of his mind, it dissolved the moment he saw her. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5'7", with dark chestnut hair pulled back under a hat that had survived a considerable journey with a dignity that Raymond found impressive. Her blue traveling coat was exactly as described, slightly dusty at the hem, and her eyes, when they swept the small depot and landed on him standing by the wagon, were a very clear, very direct hazel that did not waver. She walked toward him without hesitation and extended her hand. "You are Raymond Winslow," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "Welcome to Cimarron." "Thank you." She looked past him at the wagon, then at the road heading south out of town, then back at him. "How far is the ranch?" "About 2 hours," he said. "The road is rough in places." "I suspected it would be." She turned and directed the stage driver, with calm and precise authority, to unload her trunk first and then her bags, and Raymond found himself simply watching because she had the situation entirely in hand. He loaded her things into the wagon, and she climbed up to the bench without waiting for assistance, which startled him enough that he nearly missed grabbing the side rail as he swung up beside her. She noticed. He thought he saw the corner of her mouth move, but she was already looking at the road ahead. They drove south out of Cimarron in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him. He had prepared conversation, small talk, questions about her journey. He found he did not need any of it because the silence between them was oddly easy, like the silence between two people who have already agreed on something important and do not need to discuss it further. It was Charlotte who broke it, about 20 minutes out of town, when the Cimarron River came into view on their left, running clear and quick along its rocky bed, and the first real stretch of the Winslow land appeared ahead of them, grass going gold and green in the late April warmth. "That is yours?" she asked. "Most of what you can see," he said. She looked at it for a long time. The hills rolling south toward the ranch proper, the dark line of cottonwood trees marking the river, the far edge of the grazing meadow where a dozen horses were moving in the afternoon light. "You raise horses," she said. "Quarter horses mostly, some breeding stock. I have a good stallion named Copperhead who has thrown some of the finest colts in the territory." He paused. "I also run about 300 cattle, but the horses are what this land is best for." "The letters mentioned a problem with a neighboring cattle company," she said. He glanced at her. She was looking at the land, not at him, but her attention was total. "Gerald Halston. He has been trying to buy me out." When I said no, he started pressuring the water rights along the south pasture. He claims his cattle have right of access to the creek that cuts through my lower fence line. Do they? They do not. The creek originates on my land, but Ralston has a lawyer in Santa Fe, and I have been too busy keeping this ranch running to fight a legal battle properly. He said it plainly. He did not like admitting it, but he had said similar things in his letter to her, and he was not going to pretend the problems did not exist now that she was here. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will need to see those water rights documents. And any correspondence you have from Ralston or his attorney. I will get them for you," he said. She nodded once, as if that settled the matter entirely, and went back to watching the land. They came over a low rise, and the ranch house came into view below them, set against the hills with the long bunkhouse off to its right and the horse barn beyond that, and Raymond watched her see it for the first time. The house was not grand. It was solid 2 stories of adobe and timber that he had spent 6 months building with his own hands and the help of 2 of his best men, with a covered porch running the full length of the front and a kitchen garden that had been neglected for the past season and showed it. "The kitchen garden needs work," Charlotte said. "I know," he said. "I have not had the time." "I will sort that out," she said. And then quietly, almost to herself, "It is a good house." Something about the way she said it, not as a compliment exactly, but as an assessment, as if she were taking ownership of the fact of its goodness, made Raymond's throat do something peculiar that he chose not to examine too closely. His 3 ranch hands were gathered near the barn when the wagon pulled in. Tom Beckett was the oldest, 52, with a gray mustache, and 20 years of experience on working ranches across Texas and New Mexico. Jesse Ramos was 23, quick and good-natured, the best natural horseman Raymond had ever seen. And Dutch Kowalski was 35, German-born, methodical and steady, the man Raymond trusted most with anything that required patience. All 3 of them had taken off their hats before the wagon fully stopped. "This is Charlotte Ralston," Raymond said. "She will be managing the household accounts and the ranch correspondence, and I expect her word to be treated the same as mine." None of the 3 men said anything that could be considered difficult. Tom Beckett actually smiled, which was rare enough that Jesse noticed and gave Dutch a look. Charlotte looked at each of them in turn, the same level, direct attention she had turned on the land, the house, the water rights problem. "I appreciate that," she said. "I will try not to be a burden to anyone." "You have never been a burden to anyone in your life," Tom Beckett said, with the confidence of a man who could read character at a glance, "and I expect you do not intend to start now." Charlotte looked at him with something that was almost surprise. Then she smiled, a real smile, not the polite, careful kind, and Raymond decided that he liked Tom Beckett more than he ever had before. He showed her the house. She walked through it with the same methodical attention she had given everything else, opening cupboards, noting the state of the pantry, looking at the account book stacked on the desk in the small office off the main room, and when she came to the upstairs room that he had prepared for her, the better of the 2 bedrooms, the one with the window that looked south over the grazing meadow. She stood at the window for a moment and watched the horses moving in the last of the afternoon sun. "It is beautiful," she said. "I think so," he said from the doorway. He was being careful not to crowd her space. She turned from the window and looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was difficult to read, not guarded exactly, but considered. "I want to be clear about what this arrangement is," she said. "Of course," he said. "I am here to work. I will do the work I said I would do. I want you to understand that I did not come here in search of." She started again. "I have seen how these arrangements can go. The woman arrives and the expectation shifts. I want to be certain that we understand each other." Raymond looked at her steadily. "The letters I sent were honest," he said. "I need a capable person to help me run this ranch. I have no intention of pressuring you into anything beyond what we agreed in writing. You have my word on that." She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. "Good," she said. "Then I think we will get along very well." He found out on her second morning that she was up before him. He came downstairs at 5:30, which was his usual time, and found the kitchen warm, coffee already made, and Charlotte at the desk in the office with the account books open, and a lamp burning, and a piece of paper beside her with columns of figures in a neat, small hand. She looked up when he came to the doorway. "Your feed supplier is charging you 8% more than the going rate in Cimarron," she said. "Has been for at least 2 seasons by what I can see in the ledgers." Raymond stood in the doorway in his work shirt and suspenders and stared at her. "Are you certain? I will need to verify with the prices at the dry goods in town, but yes, I am fairly certain." She held up the piece of paper. "Do you want to see the figures?" He came in and looked at them. She had laid it out with remarkable clarity. The amounts paid, the dates, the suppliers' listed prices against what she had found recorded in the order ledgers, and the difference, column by column. "That is Henry Marsh," Raymond said. "I have been buying from him for 2 years." "I know," she said. "His name is in every purchase entry." She did not say anything further, just waited. "I will ride into town today and have a conversation with him," Raymond said. "I would like to come," Charlotte said. He looked at her. "All right," he said. They rode into Cimarron together that morning, Charlotte on a steady roan mare named Pearl that she had taken out of the barn herself and saddled without asking where the tack was kept. She had simply found it, which Raymond noted with quiet admiration. Henry Marsh was in his warehouse when they arrived, a soft-faced man with the kind of expansive goodwill that Raymond now recognized, in retrospect, as the practiced warmth of a man who relied on other people's trust. Charlotte did not raise her voice. She laid the figures on Henry Marsh's counter with the same calm she seemed to bring to everything, and she walked him through them line by line, and she asked him, very politely, to explain the discrepancy. Henry Marsh's face went through several changes. He tried bluster. He tried confusion. He tried a complicated story about freight costs. Charlotte listened to all of it and then said, with the kind of patience that was somehow more devastating than anger, "Mr. Marsh, we both know what those numbers mean. The question is whether you would like to correct this arrangement going forward, or whether Mr. Winslow should take his business to the supplier in Springer." Raymond said nothing. He stood slightly behind Charlotte with his arms folded and let her handle it, because she was handling it with a precision that he could not have matched, and he was honest enough to admit it. Henry Marsh agreed to an immediate correction of his pricing, and, after a further quiet exchange from Charlotte, to a credit against the next 2 months of orders that would go some way toward recovering what had been overpaid. They rode back to the ranch in the warm late-morning sun, and Raymond found himself looking at her sideways. The way the light caught the chestnut of her hair under her hat, the easy way she sat the mare as if she had been riding this particular valley road her whole life. "How did you know he would agree?" he asked. "I did not know," she said. "But most people will choose the easier path if you make it available to them. He is not a bad man, I think. Just an opportunist, and opportunists generally respond to the removal of the opportunity." Raymond thought about that for a moment. "You are very good at this," he said. She glanced at him. "I have had a great deal of practice at managing situations that other people made complicated," she said. And there was something beneath the matter-of-fact tone, something that he did not want to prod at because it was clearly hers to keep, but he heard it. "Your father," he said carefully. She was quiet for a moment. "He was not a bad man either," she said. "Just not a careful one. After my mother died, someone had to be." She shrugged, but it was not a dismissive shrug. It was the shrug of a person who made peace with heavy things by lifting them cleanly. "I was the oldest." "How old were your brothers?" 9 and 11, she said. "They are both grown now. The older one, Henry, is apprenticed to a printer in Springfield. The younger, Thomas, is working on a cattle spread in Kansas." She paused. "They are good men. I made sure of that." Raymond believed her entirely. The days fell into a rhythm. Charlotte was up early and at the account books or the correspondence by the time Raymond came down, and she had always either started coffee or told him exactly where everything was to start it himself, and there was never any confusion about territory or expectation. She managed the household with a brisk efficiency that made the house feel, for the first time since Raymond had built it, like it was actually being lived in rather than merely occupied. She sorted the kitchen garden inside a week. She enlisted Jesse Ramos, who turned out to have a surprisingly extensive knowledge of what grew well in Cimarron Valley soil, and together they replanted it with a practicality that Raymond found oddly moving. The way they talked through it, Charlotte with her sleeves rolled and Jesse with his hat pushed back, both of them serious about it in a way that made the garden feel important rather than merely domestic. She also, in that same first week, found the Ralston correspondence in the bottom of the desk drawer where Raymond had somewhat shamefully shoved it over the past months, and she read every letter, and she spread them out on the desk in chronological order, and she sat down with the water rights documents from the county land office and a map of the property that Raymond had drawn himself, and she was still sitting there at 10 o'clock at night when Raymond, who had come in from checking on a mare who was close to foaling, found her at the desk with the lamp burning low. "You should sleep," he said from the doorway. "In a moment," she said. She did not look up. "Ralston's attorney is arguing prior use, that his cattle used the South Creek before your fence line was established. Is that accurate?" Raymond came in and sat down across from her. "Ralston did not own that land before I bought this property. He bought his spread 2 years after I established the fence. So the prior use argument is false." "It is a flat lie," Raymond said, "but I have not had the documentation to counter it clearly." "You have the original deed," she said. She tapped the land office document. "Dated March of 1879. This establishes your water rights to the creek clearly. What you need is a letter to Ralston's attorney from a lawyer who can cite territorial water law, and you need it to be sent before Ralston files anything formal in Santa Fe." She paused. "Is there a lawyer in Cimarron?" "There is a judge who sometimes does legal work," Raymond said. "Edmund Voss, he is fair." "I will write to him tomorrow," Charlotte said, "and to the Territorial Land Office directly to put our position on record before anything else moves." She finally looked up at him. Her eyes were tired but very clear. "This is winnable, Raymond. The man is bluffing." He looked at her across the lamplit desk, this woman who had been on his land for less than 2 weeks, who had found his feed supplier's fraud, sorted his kitchen garden, reorganized his account books, and was now methodically dismantling the legal pressure that had been keeping him awake at night for the better part of a year. And he felt something shift in him that was quiet and significant and that he was not ready to name. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "I am doing what I said I would do," she said, but there was something in her voice that was softer than the words. "I know," he said. "Thank you anyway." She went back to the documents, but he thought the line of her shoulders eased, just slightly, and he went to bed with something warm sitting in the center of his chest that had not been there before. He showed her Copperhead the following Sunday, which was the only day that had anything close to a slow pace on the Winslow ranch. The stallion was a deep copper-red quarter horse of remarkable conformation, 16 hands, with a chest like a barrel and intelligence in his eyes that Raymond had never seen matched in another horse. Charlotte stood at the paddock fence and watched Copperhead move, and Raymond watched Charlotte watch the horse, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then she said, "He is extraordinary." "He is the best thing on this ranch," Raymond said, and then added almost without thinking, "until recently." She glanced at him. He looked at the horse. A pause stretched between them, charged with something that neither of them acknowledged directly, and then she said, "What will his next colt season bring?" He told her. He talked about the 3 mares he had selected for breeding, about the bloodlines he was trying to establish, about the buyer from Fort Union who had come the previous fall and paid more for a single colt than Raymond had made in 2 months of cattle sales, and Charlotte listened with the kind of attention that made a person feel that what they were saying was genuinely worth hearing. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked. "When you came here?" He thought about it. "I wanted something that was mine," he said. "Something that I built. My father's farm in Missouri was never going to be mine. I have 3 older brothers, so I came west." He looked out over the paddock. "I did not know it would be this hard." "Most things worth doing are," she said. "Is that why you came west?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I came west because I had done everything I needed to do in Illinois," she said. "My brothers were grown, the farm was sold. I was 26 years old and I had been managing someone else's life since I was 17, and I thought." She stopped. "What?" he asked quietly. She looked at him. "I thought that if I was going to do hard work, I would rather do it for something that could actually become mine, in some form." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," he said. They looked at each other for a moment in the Sunday morning light, and then Copperhead put his great head over the fence and pushed it firmly against Charlotte's shoulder. And she laughed, a real, startled, delighted laugh, and turned to rub the horse's nose. And Raymond stood there watching her with the feeling that something very important was happening to him, and that he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The trouble with Ralston came to a head in mid-May, not through legal channels, but through a more direct kind of pressure that the Cimarron Valley had seen before from men who believed that property rights were whatever you could enforce. 3 of Ralston's hands rode up to the south fence on a Wednesday afternoon and cut the wire. Raymond was in the horse barn with Dutch when Jessie came running to tell him. By the time Raymond and Jessie rode down to the south pasture, the 3 men had moved about 30 of Ralston's cattle through the gap and onto Winslow land, and they were sitting their horses with the patient confidence of men who expected no real resistance. Raymond was not a man who looked for fights, but he was also not a man who backed down from them. He rode up to the fence gap and looked at the 3 Ralston hands across the width of the cut wire. The man in the front was large, with a flat face and small eyes, and Raymond recognized him as a man called Briggs who had a reputation in the territory that was not entirely savory. "Get your cattle off my land," Raymond said. "Mr. Ralston says this is his water access," Briggs said. "Says you have been blocking it illegally." "Mr. Ralston is wrong," Raymond said. "And his attorney knows it because we have corresponded with Edmund Voss this week, and the water rights are on record at the land office in Santa Fe." He kept his voice even. "Get your cattle off my land and repair the fence you cut. Today." Briggs looked at his companions and then back at Raymond with an expression that suggested he was considering his options. Then a horse came up on Raymond's right, and he turned to see Charlotte on Pearl, sitting the roan mare with absolute composure, and she was holding, he noticed with a complicated mix of alarm and admiration, his Winchester rifle, which she had apparently taken from the house. "I have written to the United States Marshal's office in Santa Fe as well," Charlotte said to Briggs, in the same calm tone she used for everything. "A letter regarding fence cutting and unlawful trespass. I sent it Monday. My understanding is that fence cutting is a serious criminal matter in this territory." She paused. "I would imagine Mr. Ralston is aware of that." Briggs stared at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. "You have until this evening to clear those cattle and repair that fence," Charlotte said. "After that, the matter will be entirely in the hands of the marshal." There was a long silence. Jessie Ramos, behind Raymond, was very still. Dutch, who had ridden up quietly on Raymond's left, had his hand near his own rifle. Briggs looked at Raymond. Raymond looked back at him without expression. "We will take the cattle," Briggs said finally. "But this is not finished." "I expect not," Charlotte said pleasantly. "Good afternoon." Briggs turned his horse and moved his men and Ralston's cattle back through the fence gap and onto Ralston land. Raymond watched them go. Then he turned to Charlotte. She was lowering the rifle, and her hands, he noticed, were very steady. "Had you actually written to the marshal?" he asked. "I wrote on Monday, yes," she said. "I told you I was going to put things on record." She met his eyes. "I do not bluff, Raymond." He looked at her for a long moment. Jessie made a small sound behind him that might have been a laugh quickly suppressed. Dutch said something in German under his breath that Raymond suspected was admiring. "You should not have ridden down here alone," Raymond said, and even as he said it he knew how it sounded. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. I did not ride down here alone. I rode down here with a rifle. She paused. Besides, you were here. You did not know I would be here. I knew you would ride down as soon as Jesse told you. I came to be useful. She looked at him steadily. I am always going to come to be useful, Raymond. You may as well accept that now. He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded slowly, and something that was not entirely unlike pride moved through him, though whether it was pride in her or simply pride at the astonishing fortune of having her here, he could not entirely distinguish. The fence will need to be repaired, he said. Yes, she agreed. I will hold the wire. He stared at her. Jesse can stretch it, she said, and you can post. I have done it before. She turned Pearl toward the gap in the fence. Let us get it done before the light goes. They repaired the fence together, the four of them, in the late afternoon sun, and Raymond worked beside Charlotte, and they passed tools and wire and posts back and forth with an ease that felt like something they had been doing for years rather than weeks. And when it was done, they stood back and looked at the repaired line in the last gold light of the evening, and Charlotte said, with satisfaction deep in her voice, "There." He drove her back to the house in the cart because she had been on her feet all day, and it was a long ride back, and Pearl was tired. Stars were beginning to come out over the Cimarron hills, enormous and clear in the way that Raymond had never seen anywhere else, and Charlotte sat beside him on the cart bench and tilted her head back to look at them. They are something here, she said. There is nothing between you and them, he said. No city smoke, no trees thick enough to block them, just sky. I know, she said. She was still looking up. I have been watching them every night from my window. I never saw stars like this in Illinois. He looked at her profile against the dark sky, the line of her jaw, the curve of her throat, and he made himself look back at the road. Charlotte, he said. Yes. She brought her eyes down from the sky. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with more care than he usually gave them. I want you to know, he said, that what you have done here in these few weeks, it has meant more to me than I can say easily. The feed supplier, the Ralston correspondence, today he started again. I want you to know that I see it, all of it. She was quiet for a moment. The horse walked steadily on the dark road. Thank you, she said softly. I also want to say, he stopped again, reached for honesty the way he would reach for a tool he knew how to use. I did not know what to expect when I wrote that first letter. I was not certain this arrangement was going to work. I want you to know that I am certain now. About the arrangement, he paused. About you being here. She looked at him in the darkness. He could see her eyes clearly enough to see that something in them had shifted. I am glad, she said. I was not certain either, but I am now, a beat. About the arrangement. He heard the small echo in the way she said it, and his heart did something significant under his ribs. About the arrangement, he agreed. And they drove back to the house in a silence that was not about anything practical at all. The summer arrived with heat that came down on the Cimarron Valley like something physical, pressing the breath out of the air between noon and 3 in the afternoon. And Charlotte navigated it with the same practicality she brought to everything, reorganizing the household schedule, so that the heaviest work was done in the early morning and the evening, taking her work outside to the porch when the house grew too close, and maintaining a garden that was, by late June, producing enough beans and squash and tomatoes to supplement the ranch's food supply in ways that visibly pleased Dutch Kowalski, who turned out to be a serious and dedicated cook. Raymond rode out with his hands every day and came home in the evenings to find supper ready, the household accounts updated, the correspondence answered, and increasingly Charlotte on the porch in the cooling evening air, working on something or simply watching the horses in the near pasture with an expression of quiet contentment that made something in Raymond's chest tight every time he saw it. They had taken to sitting on the porch after supper most evenings. It had begun simply, Raymond sitting down because he was tired and the evening air was fine, Charlotte already there with her mending or her account book, and neither of them suggesting they leave. Now it was simply the way the day ended on the Winslow ranch, as established and natural as the morning coffee. They talked, not always about the ranch, sometimes about things that surprised him, she had read widely, this woman who had spent 9 years managing practical crises, and she had opinions about things that he had never thought to have opinions about, and listening to her articulate them was one of the more interesting experiences of his life. She asked him questions that required him to actually think about his answers rather than give the first thing that came to mind. She asked him once, in early July, whether he had ever regretted leaving Missouri. He sat with the question for a while. The night sounds of the valley settled around them, crickets and the distant movement of horses and the vast quiet of the land. "Not once," he said, "not even in the hard times, because this is mine." She nodded. She was looking at the dark outline of the hills. "Is that selfish?" he asked. "No," she said. "I think it is the opposite of selfish, actually. You made something, you built it yourself. Selfish would be sitting in Missouri waiting for someone to hand you a piece of your father's farm." He looked at her. "Did you feel that way about staying in Springfield?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I stayed because my brothers needed me to stay, and when they no longer needed me to stay, I left, which I think is the right sequence of events, even if it took longer than I might have wished." "What would you have done if you had left earlier?" he asked. She glanced at him with a small, wry smile. "Exactly this," she said, "or something like it. I have always known I was built for wide spaces." She looked back at the hills. "I just had to wait until there was room for me in one." He wanted very much to say something to her in that moment. Something that would tell her what he was feeling, which was essentially that the wide space she was looking at, this entire valley, this ranch, this life, felt more like hers every day, and that he did not find that frightening in the least. What he said instead was, "The South Meadow mare foaled this morning. Twins." Charlotte turned to look at him, and her face opened into that startled, delighted expression he had seen only a few times and that he had begun privately to collect. "Twins," she said. "Both sound." "Both sound. Dutch has been fussing over them all day." She stood up immediately. "Can we go see?" He was already on his feet. "I thought you would want to." They walked to the barn together in the dark, with the stars brilliant overhead and the warm air moving gently through the cottonwoods along the river, and Charlotte moved beside him on the path in a way that had become easy and natural, their steps matching without either of them trying. In the barn, in the soft golden light of the hung lanterns, they found Dutch sitting on an overturned bucket outside the foaling stall with an expression of absolute satisfaction. And inside the stall the mare stood patient and tired and beautiful, and beside her, tucked close against her flank, were two small, impossibly leggy creatures with enormous dark eyes. Charlotte made a sound, a soft, involuntary sound, and her hand went to her throat. Raymond stood beside her at the stall door and watched her watch the foals, and the lantern light was warm on her face, and he thought that whatever it was that had been building in him since the day she stepped off the stage at Cimarron, it had arrived fully and without any further possibility of being called something practical. "They are the most beautiful things I have ever seen," Charlotte said, very quietly, as if she were afraid of startling them. "Yes," Raymond said. He was not looking at the foals. She turned to look at him. She had been turning to look at him frequently in recent weeks, in moments that seemed to call for shared attention, and each time she did it he had the sense of something locking into place. This time she looked at him and he looked back at her, and neither of them looked away, and the silence between them had a different quality than it ever had before, charged and close and significant. "Raymond," she said. "I know," he said, and he meant it. He knew exactly what she was saying without the rest of it, because it was the same thing he had been saying to himself in the evenings on the porch when he watched her read, in the mornings when he heard her voice before he came downstairs, in the afternoons when he rode the fence lines and found himself calculating how quickly he could be back at the house. She made a small movement, almost imperceptible, that closed the distance between them by half an inch, and he closed the rest of it, and he kissed her very gently in the lamplight, with Dutch politely examining the ceiling of the barn, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and it was nothing like a tentative first step. It was more like an arrival, When they stepped apart, Dutch Kowalski was still examining the ceiling with great interest. "Dutch," Raymond said. Dutch said. "Thank you for sitting with the mayor." "Of course," Dutch said with enormous dignity. "Good night." Charlotte was smiling. Raymond took her hand, because it seemed like the right thing to do, and she did not pull it away, and they walked back to the house in the warm summer dark with the stars overhead, and he held her hand the whole way. There was still the matter of Gerald Halston. Edmund Voss, the judge in Cimarron, had responded to Charlotte's letter with the thoroughness of a man who disliked the Halston Cattle Company on general principle, having seen similar operations squeeze out smaller ranchers across 3 counties. He had reviewed the water rights documentation and the territorial land records, and had written a formal legal opinion that was, in his own words, unambiguous. The South Creek belonged entirely within the established water rights of the Winslow Ranch, and any attempt by the Halston operation to claim prior use was without legal foundation. Charlotte had taken that opinion and written a letter to Halston's attorney in Santa Fe that Raymond read twice before she sent it, once because he wanted to understand it, and once simply because reading something Charlotte Ralston had written was a satisfaction in itself. It was clear, courteous, precisely documented, and had the quality of a closed door, not slammed, but shut with quiet and absolute finality. Halston's attorney had not responded for 2 weeks, which Charlotte said was a good sign. Then Gerald Halston himself rode up to the Winslow Ranch on a Thursday morning in late July. He was a big man, Halston, running to heaviness now in his 60s, with the manner of a man who had spent 4 decades expecting the world to arrange itself to his convenience. He came with 2 of his hands and no lawyer, which Charlotte, watching from the kitchen window, noted with interest. Raymond went out to meet him. Charlotte came out behind him and stood on the porch with her arms folded, and Halston noticed her, and his eyes moved from her to Raymond with an expression that was not quite a sneer but was in the neighborhood. "Winslow," he said. "Halston," Raymond said. "I have come to make you a final offer on the property," Halston said in the tone of a man doing someone a favor. $22,000. That is twice what the land is worth in this market." "I appreciate the offer," Raymond said. "The answer is no." Halston looked at him for a moment. "You want to think on it," he said. "The Cimarron Valley is getting harder for small operations. The railroad is coming through to the east. Water is going to be a problem for the next decade. I'm offering you a clean way out." "I do not want a way out," Raymond said. "I want you to have a conversation with your attorney about the water rights letter from Voss, and then I want your cattle to stay on your side of my fence." Halston's jaw tightened. He looked past Raymond at Charlotte on the porch. "Who is she?" he asked. "She manages this ranch," Raymond said. Halston made a small dismissive sound. "Voss's opinion is not binding," he said. "I can take this to the territorial court in Santa Fe." "You are welcome to do that," Charlotte said from the porch pleasantly. "We have already filed our position with the Territorial Land Office and with the United States Marshal's Office. If you wish to take this to court, we will be fully prepared, and we will also be filing a claim for the value of the fence cutting that occurred on the 17th of May, which Mr. Voss has advised us constitutes criminal property damage under territorial statute." She paused. "Of course, that is entirely your decision." Halston looked at her for a long moment. "I was told you were a household manager," he said. "I manage a great many things," Charlotte said. Halston looked back at Raymond. Raymond waited. "The water rights are yours," Halston said finally. It came out of him like something extracted under pressure, and Raymond understood that the man would spend the rest of his life resenting it, but that was Halston's problem. "My cattle will use the eastern creek on my own land. I want it understood between us." "Understood," Raymond said. Halston turned his horse and rode away without another word, and his 2 hands fell in behind him, and the 3 of them rode back the way they had come through the summer heat. Raymond turned around and looked at Charlotte on the porch. She looked back at him and let out a long, slow breath, and he saw, for just a moment, that her composure was a constructed thing built on top of something that felt things fully, and that she had been as wound as a clock spring since Halston rode up. He climbed the porch steps and stood in front of her, and she looked at him with her chin up and her eyes very bright. "That was well done," he said. "He is not entirely finished," she said. "Men like that do not simply stop. But he will not move on the water rights again. That much is done." "That is enough for today," Raymond said. She nodded. Then something released in her, and she stepped forward, and he put his arms around her, and she stood in the circle of them for a moment with her forehead against his shoulder, and they stayed like that in the porch shade while the summer morning moved around them. "Charlotte," he said into her hair. "I am all right," she said. "I just needed a moment." "Take all the moments you need," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him. "I need to be clear about something," she said. He waited. "I am not in love with the arrangement anymore," she said. "I am in love with you. I want that to be said plainly because I am not a person who does things indirectly." He looked at her for a moment, this extraordinary woman, and he thought about the letter she had written that first time, direct, plain-spoken, no interest in being an ornament. He thought about her on Pearl riding down to the south fence with a Winchester. He thought about her face in the lamplight looking at the foals. He thought about every morning and every evening on the porch, and every night when he could see the light under her door long after he had gone to bed. Still working, always present in this life that she had stepped into and made genuinely hers. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the third day you were here, and I have been trying to behave honorably about it ever since." Her mouth curved. "How is that working for you?" "Very poorly," he said. She laughed, and he kissed her in the porch shade, and Tom Beckett, who was walking past the side of the house toward the barn, made a very deliberate detour in the other direction, and was heard, sometime later, telling Jessie Ramos that he had known from the moment she stepped off that stage that she was exactly what the Winslow ranch had been missing. Jessie said he had known from the moment she held the Winchester. Dutch said he had known in the foaling barn. All three of them were right, in their way. Raymond proposed to Charlotte on a Sunday evening in August, on the porch, in the hour before sunset when the sky over the Cimarron hills went every shade of orange and gold, and the horses in the near pasture caught the light and glowed like copper. He had thought about how to do it, and had decided that anything elaborate would feel wrong for both of them. Charlotte was not a woman for elaborate gestures, and he was not a man who made them easily, and so he simply told her what was true. He told her that he had spent 31 years building something that was his and had realized this summer that the thing he was building needed her in it permanently. Not as a manager or a housekeeper or a woman who had come west under a practical arrangement. As his wife. As his partner in the fullest sense of the word. He told her that he had nothing to offer her that she had not already been offered: the ranch, the land, the horses, the hard work and the wide sky, but that he was offering all of it again, this time with himself added to it. He told her that she was the most remarkable person he had ever known. Charlotte sat and listened to all of this without interrupting, which was notable because Charlotte interrupted with considerable regularity when she disagreed or had something to add. The fact that she let him finish said something. When he finished, she said, "Yes." Just that. Yes. Plain and direct and absolute in exactly the way she did everything. He had, it turned out, a ring, a simple gold band that had been his mother's, which he had carried west from Missouri in the inside pocket of his good coat without entirely knowing why, and which fit Charlotte's left hand with a precision that he chose to interpret as fate, regardless of what a practical man might say about such things. She looked at it on her hand and then looked at him, and her expression was the one he had begun to love the most, the one that came through when her composure stepped aside and let what she actually felt come forward, and what she felt was in this moment so visible in her face that he felt it in his own chest. "I did not come here expecting this," she said. "I did not either," he said. "I am very glad," she said, "that I came anyway." "So am I," he said, "every single day." They were married in September of 1882 in Cimarron, in the small church that served the valley, with Tom Beckett and Jesse Ramos and Dutch Kowalski as witnesses, and Edmund Voss and his wife, and a few of the neighboring ranchers who had come to like Charlotte considerably over the summer. Eliza, Raymond's cousin in Denver, sent an extravagant letter full of exclamation marks, and a set of good china that arrived with only 2 pieces broken from the stage journey. Charlotte wrote her a long, warm letter back that Raymond read over her shoulder, and that made him feel that Eliza's matchmaking career had reached its pinnacle. The ceremony was short and direct, which suited both of them. The celebration afterward was not short. Dutch had been cooking for 2 days, and the bunkhouse had been decorated by Jesse with a thoroughness that suggested he had opinions about festivities. And it lasted well into the evening, and at some point Raymond and Charlotte slipped away from it and stood outside the church under the September stars, and Raymond's hand found hers in the dark and held it, and they stood there listening to the sounds of the party inside with the vast New Mexico sky above them. "How does it feel?" he asked her. She was quiet for a moment, her thumb moving across the back of his hand. "Like arriving," she said. He understood exactly what she meant because it was exactly what he felt. They had both been traveling toward this without knowing the destination, and here it was, certain and solid under their feet. The fall came in cool and brilliant, the cottonwoods along the Cimarron River going gold and the air sharp with the promise of winter, and the ranch moved into its autumn rhythms. The horses brought into the closer pastures, the cattle sorted, the supplies laid in, the house prepared for the season. Charlotte threw herself into all of it with an energy that Raymond suspected would have alarmed a different kind of man, but that he found simply and consistently wonderful. She was also, by November, beginning to understand the horse business in a way that went beyond bookkeeping. She had always been comfortable on horseback, but now she was learning the language of it, watching how Raymond and Jesse assessed the horses, listening to the way they talked about bloodlines and conformation, and the particular qualities that made a quarter horse useful on working land. She asked questions with the same directness she brought to everything, and Raymond answered them with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. And somewhere in those conversations, the horse business stopped being Raymond's area and became something they both understood. In late November, a buyer came from Texas, a rancher named Aldous Crane who had heard about Copperhead's colts through the network of working ranchers that operated across the Southern Territories. He arrived with money to spend and very high standards, and Raymond gave Charlotte the figures and the bloodline records, and they walked through the horse barn together with Crane, and Charlotte handled the negotiation with a calm authority that Crane, to his credit, responded to without visible difficulty. They sold him 2 of Copperhead's yearling colts at a price that represented the best single transaction the Winslow Ranch had ever made, and Crane left with the horses and a standing offer to buy from any future foal season, and Charlotte made note of everything in the account book in her small, neat hand, and then looked at the figures and looked at Raymond. "Next year," she said, "I would like to increase the breeding program. 2 more mares. We have the pasture." He looked at her and felt the particular pleasure of being understood by someone who was also building. 2 more mares, he agreed. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard, as winters in the Cimarron Valley often were, with heavy snow in January that kept everyone close to the ranch and required daily attention to the horses and cattle. That was cold, physical, demanding work. Raymond and his hands handled the outdoor work with the efficiency of a team that had learned to function without wasted motion, and Charlotte kept the house warm, and the food plentiful, and the accounts updated, and morale high through what Tom Beckett declared was the best-managed hard winter he had ever worked through on any ranch in his considerable experience. On a quiet February afternoon with snow falling softly outside and a fire going in the main room, Charlotte came to find Raymond in the small office where he was reviewing the spring supply orders. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke, and something in the way she stood made him look up. "I believe," she said with careful calm, "that we are going to need the second bedroom prepared differently than it currently is." He looked at her. Understanding arrived. "Charlotte," he said. "Spring," she said. "I am fairly certain." He stood up from the desk and crossed the office in 3 steps, and she met him halfway, and he held her very carefully, which made her laugh because she was not fragile, and he loosened his hold and held her properly, and they stood there in the lamplight with the snow falling outside and the fire warm behind them. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said into his shoulder. "I rather think so." How are you?" "I am well," she said. "I feel well. I will continue to feel well and to manage this ranch with complete competence, and you are not to treat me as if I have suddenly become made of glass." "I was not going to," he said, though he had been briefly going to. "Good," she said. "Because we have spring supply orders to finalize, and Dutch wants to plant a larger kitchen garden this year, and Jessie thinks the east fence needs new posts along the lower run." "All of that can wait 10 minutes," Raymond said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "10 minutes is fine." The baby came in September of 1883, exactly 1 year after their wedding, as if he had consulted the calendar and found it appropriate. He was a healthy, loud, furious boy with Raymond's dark hair and Charlotte's clear eyes, and he arrived after 16 hours of labor that Charlotte managed with the same determined composure she brought to everything. And when it was done, and the midwife from Cimarron had put the baby in her arms, Charlotte looked at her son for a long, speechless moment. Raymond was beside her on the bed, which was not the usual arrangement but which the midwife had sensibly permitted because Raymond had been present and useful throughout, and there was no practical reason to remove him now. "Look at him," Charlotte said. Her voice was different than he had ever heard it, stripped of its competence and efficiency and strategic clarity down to something essential and pure. "I am looking," Raymond said. His throat was doing things that precluded useful speech. "He is extraordinary," Charlotte said. She looked up at Raymond. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names. They had a list. But looking at this particular person who had just arrived in the world with such force and opinion, Raymond said, "What does he look like to you?" Charlotte looked at the baby for a moment. "James," she said. "He looks like a James." "James Winslow," Raymond said. The baby made a sound that might have been agreement. They named him James Henry Winslow, the Henry for Charlotte's oldest brother, and they wrote to Springfield and to Kansas with the news. And Charlotte's brothers wrote back with a shared warmth that told Raymond everything he needed to know about what kind of a sister she had been to them. Tom Beckett, when introduced to James Henry Winslow, held the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had raised children somewhere in his past that he did not often speak about, and declared him a fine specimen. Jessie Ramos, who was 24 now, was briefly so overwhelmed by the responsibility of holding the baby that he handed James back to Raymond after approximately 30 seconds and went to stand near the barn door collecting himself. Dutch made a soup that Charlotte declared the finest thing she had ever eaten, which was saying something, and made it again every day for the first week. James grew quickly, as babies in the Cimarron Valley seemed to, perhaps the air, perhaps the constant activity of a working ranch, perhaps simply Charlotte's capable management of everything including the feeding schedule, which she kept in the account book alongside the ranch expenditures with the same neat precision. By 6 months he was large and sturdy and loud, with opinions about everything, and by his first birthday he had the horse barn under particular and intense observation from his position on Charlotte's hip during the morning rounds. "He is going to be a horseman," Jessie Ramos declared with authority. "He is going to be whatever he chooses," Charlotte said firmly. "Yes," Jessie agreed, "but he is going to choose horses." He was right, as it turned out, but that was some years away still. The years that followed were full ones. The Winslow horse breeding program grew steadily, the reputation of Copperhead's line spreading through the territory, until Raymond had more inquiries than he could satisfy in a single foal season. Charlotte expanded the breeding records into a formal system that became, over time, a genuine archive of bloodlines, foaling dates, sale records, performance notes from buyers who wrote back with reports on how their horses were working. And this archive was, in a quiet way, the thing that distinguished the Winslow operation from its competitors. Buyers knew they were getting not just a good horse but a documented one, traceable, with a history they could rely on. The water rights issue with Ralston remained settled. Ralston himself died in 1885, and his ranch was sold to a larger operation that proved to be a more reasonable neighbor, content to stay on its own side of the fence. The South Meadow remained solidly Winslow land. Tom Beckett retired from active ranch work in 1884 and stayed on in a gentler capacity that involved a great deal of sitting on the porch and advising, which Raymond and Charlotte both welcomed. Jesse Ramos became, over those years, Raymond's most valued working partner. The younger man had grown into a horseman of rare skill, and Raymond gave him increasing responsibility with the breeding program, and the trust between them was one of the good things the ranch produced. Dutch Kowalski married a woman named Margaret in 1885, a German-born widow from Raton who was as methodical and steady as Dutch himself, and who moved into the ranch cook's quarters with an authority that complemented Charlotte's without conflicting, and the kitchen became, for a time, the most diplomatically managed piece of real estate on the Winslow property. Charlotte had been clear during her pregnancy with James that she intended to continue running the ranch accounts and the correspondence and the breeding records and whatever else needed running. And she did exactly that, and there was never a period in which the ranch suffered from divided attention because Charlotte's attention was, simply, undivided. She was the kind of person who could do several things fully at once, which Raymond had understood from nearly the first day, and which never stopped astonishing him. In 1886, James was 3 years old and terrifying in the way that 3-year-olds on working ranches can be independent, fearless, convinced that horses were his personal property, and in possession of his mother's absolute refusal to be deterred. Charlotte managed him with the same calm, consistent authority she managed everything else, and James responded to it the same way everyone else did, which was to stop fighting it and simply get things done. In the fall of 1886, Charlotte told Raymond, in the same matter-of-fact way she had told him about James, that they would need the second bedroom prepared again. "Another one," Raymond said. "Another one," she confirmed. "April, I think." He kissed her in the kitchen with the morning sun coming through the window, and she let him, and then she said, "The South Pasture mare is due in 3 weeks. Dutch needs the supply list for winter provisioning, and Jesse thinks the Crane family in Texas may be interested in 2 fillies from this year's foal season." "Good morning to you too," he said. She smiled at him over her coffee. "Good morning," she said. "It really is a very good morning." The second child arrived in April of 1887. As predicted, Charlotte was always accurate, and she was a girl, solid and pink and furiously opinionated from the first hour, and Charlotte held her and looked at her and said, "Margaret." "Margaret Winslow," Raymond said. "She will be called Maggie," Charlotte said, "and she will have opinions about everything, and I am very glad." "How can you tell already?" Raymond asked. "Look at her," Charlotte said. He looked. The baby looked back at him with Charlotte's clear, steady eyes, and Raymond laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that Charlotte had spent years patiently coaxing out of him, and Maggie appeared to find it acceptable. James was introduced to his sister with great ceremony, and examined her with the focused attention of a small scientist, and declared her acceptable, which was his highest praise that year. He was 4 years old and already on horseback with Jesse on the leading rein, and he sat a horse with a natural ease that made Raymond watch him with a quiet, private pride that he tried not to make too obvious, because Charlotte had opinions about fathers who expected their sons to repeat their own interests. Tom Beckett sat on the porch and told Maggie, who was 3 days old, that she was going to be fine. He said this with the authority of a man who had lived long enough to have opinions about what fine looked like, and everyone in hearing range believed him. The Winslow Ranch entered the 1890s as one of the most respected small operations in the Cimarron Valley, not the largest, not the richest, but the kind of ranch that had a reputation for quality that outlasted any single season. The horse breeding program was the heart of it. Raymond had expanded it carefully, adding 3 more breeding mares over the years and investing in a second stallion whose bloodline complemented Copperhead's. And the colts and fillies that came from the Winslow barn went to working ranches across New Mexico Territory, Texas, and as far as Colorado. And buyers came back because the horses were what they were claimed to be, and the records behind them were what they were claimed to be, and the people who ran the operation were what they were claimed to be. Copperhead himself lived to 22, which was a long life for a working stallion, and when he died on a June morning in 1892, Raymond found him in the paddock at first light and stood with him for a long time, and Charlotte came out when she saw him standing there and stood beside him with her hand in his, and neither of them said anything for a while. "He was the beginning of all of it," Raymond said finally. "Yes," Charlotte said, "the best horse I ever owned." "The best horse I ever knew," Charlotte said, though James would argue. Raymond smiled despite himself. James was 9 now and had strong opinions about every horse on the property, and his current favorite was a 3-year-old colt of Copperhead's last foal season, a compact gray horse that James had named Smoke, and that he talked about with an authority that made Jesse Ramos nod in professional recognition. They buried Copperhead in the near pasture, under the cottonwood tree that Charlotte had always said was the best tree on the property, and Jesse built a small fence around the grave that was simple and solid, and every horse on the Winslow Ranch was turned through that pasture at some point and seemed, in the way of horses, to know something had changed there. Charlotte was 40 years old in the spring of 1897, and she stood in the kitchen garden on a bright March morning, her hands in the good Cimarron soil, with the valley spread out behind her and the ranch moving through its morning rhythms around her. And she thought about the woman who had stood at a train station in Chicago 15 years ago with a trunk and 2 bags, and a very short letter from a man in New Mexico Territory who had said that Headstrong was exactly what his ranch needed. She thought about what that woman had wanted: wide spaces, work that was genuinely hers, a life that fit the actual shape of her capabilities. She looked at the garden, which was producing enough to supply the ranch house and still have a surplus she had begun selling to the dry goods in Cimarron. She looked at the horse barn, where Jesse was already moving with the morning's first task, and where inside the breeding record she had kept for 15 years constituted a document of everything the Winslow operation had built. She looked at the house, her house, with the porch where she and Raymond sat most evenings still, in the same easy silence that had begun the summer they fell in love. She thought about James, who was 13 and already working full days beside his father and Jesse with the complete seriousness of a boy who knows what he wants and is in a hurry to get to it. She thought about Maggie, who was 10, and who was exactly what Charlotte had predicted, full of opinions and energy, and a stubbornness that Charlotte recognized intimately because she had looked at it in the mirror for 40 years. She thought about Raymond. She heard his step on the porch behind her before she turned, the particular weight and rhythm of it that she had known for 15 years and that she still noticed every time, the same way she still noticed the wide sky over the Cimarron hills and the smell of the river in the mornings, and the way the light came through the kitchen window at breakfast. He came down the steps and across the yard and stopped beside her, looking at what she was planting. "Squash again," he said. "Dutch asked specifically," she said. "Dutch asks for squash every year," he said, "and every year I plant it," she said, "because Dutch is worth it." Raymond crouched down beside her in the garden and looked at the turned earth with the focused, appreciative attention that was one of the things she loved most about him. The way he looked at things as if they were worth looking at. "Charlotte," he said. She looked at him. He was 46, Raymond Winslow, and the years in the Cimarron sun had put lines in his face that she found beautiful, and his hands were as calloused as they had ever been, and his hair was threaded with gray now, and he was the man she had chosen, and she knew every day that she had chosen well. 15 years this September, he said. Yes, she said. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited because he was being careful with words, which he sometimes was, and she had learned to give him the space for it. Are you glad, he said. Still, all of it. Is it what you wanted? She looked at him for a moment, this man who had written her a letter in 1882 and said that Headstrong was exactly what his ranch needed, this man who had driven a wagon 2 hours to meet a stranger at a stage depot and had not looked away from her since. Raymond, she said. Yes, he said. I arrived here in April of 1882 on a stage that was 2 hours late, she said, with a trunk and 2 bags and no very clear idea of what I was going to find. And what I found was, she paused. Looked at the garden, the house, the hills, the morning. Everything, she said. I found everything. He looked at her with an expression that was, as it had always been, worth every hard thing she had ever navigated to get here. So am I, he said. Every single day, Charlotte, every single day. He reached out and took her hand, her left hand, where his mother's ring still sat, worn smooth now and warm in the morning sun, and she turned her hand to hold his back, and they knelt there together in the garden with the Cimarron Valley wide and bright around them, and the horses moving in the near pasture, and the sound of James's voice from somewhere near the barn asking Jessie something with great seriousness, and Maggie's answer coming back louder than the question, because that was how Maggie did things. And Dutch somewhere inside beginning the breakfast that would smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the particular warm safety of a house that had been genuinely lived in for 15 years. The sky over the Cimarron hills was the blue that Charlotte had been watching from her window since the first morning she woke in this place and looked south and felt the land looking back at her. It was, she thought, exactly the right shade of blue for a life that had arrived where it was supposed to go. Raymond turned her hand over in his, the way he did sometimes, reading the calluses and the soil and the years in her palm the way he might read a map of something he had built and was proud of. I am going to ask Voss to dinner next week, he said. He has been asking about the horses. Invite his wife, Charlotte said. She and I have things to discuss about the schoolhouse fundraising. I thought you might, he said. She stood up and pulled him up with her, and they walked together toward the house in the morning light, and Raymond held the kitchen door open for her, and she went in. The coffee was on. Dutch had already started the biscuits. Through the window, the Cimarron Valley was wide and golden and absolutely, completely theirs. James came in from the barn 20 minutes later with soil on his boots, and a question about a horse's left foreleg, and the absolute confidence of a boy who knew he was home. Maggie was already at the table arguing with Dutch about whether the biscuits needed more time, and Dutch was tolerating this with the dignity of a man secure in his baking. Raymond sat down with his coffee and looked at Charlotte across the table, and she looked back at him over the rim of her cup with her clear hazel eyes. And that was the morning, and the morning was good. The afternoon brought work, as it always did. Raymond and Jessie out with the horses, Charlotte at the desk with the breeding records, and a letter from a buyer in Colorado who was interested in 3 fillies from the current season. Maggie helping Dutch in the kitchen with a thoroughness that was all Charlotte and a speed that was pure Maggie. James already in the paddock with Smoke, putting the gray colt through his paces with the focused patience of a boy who would someday be one of the best horsemen in this territory. The evening brought the porch, and the sunset over the hills, and Raymond's hand finding Charlotte's in the cooling air, and the stars coming out over the Cimarron Valley one by one, until the whole enormous sky was bright with them. And the next day brought all of it again, and the one after that. And the Winslow Ranch stood in the Cimarron Valley as it had stood since Raymond built it with his own hands, and as it would stand now, because 2 people had chosen it and each other, and neither of them had ever been the kind to walk away from something worth keeping.